My name is Ardath Whynacht, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Concordia University, and I teach sociology and critical criminology at Mount Allison University. My research and my activist work looks at the ways in which our notions of trauma have political, social, and also material implications in terms of how trauma is felt and carried in the body, and some of the implications around what's considered trauma and what isn't, and how that becomes really problematic in terms of certain types of violence being accepted and certain types of wounding, kind of invalidated in larger medical and judicial systems. And of course, trauma is a huge kind of underpinning idea when we want to address decarceration, because we know that the overwhelming majority of folks in Canadian prisons have substance abuse issues and mental health issues, and for a lot of them, substance use was one of the reasons for their incarceration, and we know that substance abuse comes from trauma. So when you look at violent crime, when you look at forms of marginalization that lead to criminal arrest, when you look at the effects of those larger structures of colonialism, patriarchy, racism, white supremacy, those are all structures that traumatize the bodies and, the emotional lives of some more than others. And that trauma is then sort of carried forward in some of the violence we enact between and amongst each other. So, yeah, I guess those are the big questions that I'm interested in.
So one of the things after the Ghomeshi verdict, there's obviously been a huge conversation in Canada, particularly with women saying that the justice system isn't working. Suggestions that we need separate court for sexual assault survivors, or we need a different way of doing things. And one of the things that I found challenging as a feminist is this question of how we can continue to challenge sexual assault, how we can hold people accountable, but also obviously the issues I have around the incarceration system, and in particular obviously how that system most disproportionately affects Indigenous people, Black people, poor people, women of color. So this kind of question is how as feminists we can address sexual assault, but is our solution always through the courtroom? Is it through prison, or are there other solutions?
Yeah, I think to all of a sudden say now, as a result of the Ghomeshi verdict, the justice system isn't working, that's a statement of privilege to think that it ever did. I think if you have lived experience of mental illness, I think if you come from a poor community, a marginalized or racialized community, I think it's already abundantly clear that the justice system we have doesn't work. It's also really morally simplistic in the sense that, as a consequence of colonialism, is we tend to adopt these, dualistic modes of understanding good and bad. Everything is in opposites, and there's a victim and there's an offender, and one person is a bad person and the other person is a good person. And we're not allowed to have any gray areas, and those gray areas, of course, lead to, verdicts like the Ghomeshi verdict, where the goodness of those who accused him of sexual assault was called into question. They were considered liars and not reputable. So it all comes down to these kind of silly, simplistic ideas of, whether or not you are a moral victim, and whether your trauma is legible within, these colonial and often highly medicalized understandings of what it means to be harmed by sexual violence. And I think in terms of, I don't think what we need right now is a prescription of how to move forward. I think what we need are conversations, and I think that those conversations have to include survivors, but we also have to question what that term survivor carries with it. It's generally a white heterosexual woman, and we know that men are survivors of sexual violence. We know that queer people are survivors of sexual violence, and we also know that the term survivor is not one that all those who've experienced sexual violence want to take up. And there's also gray areas in terms of the experience of sexual violence. Someone can have a dozen really bad dates where consent wasn't respected at various points during the date, but you take all those dates together and it might sediment itself into sort of a larger feelings of wounding, but we tend to only consider, a stranger sexual assault that's highly violent as something that, counts. I think that we talk a lot about rape culture, and I think that that's a good step forward because it makes us think about the ways in which, those tiny violences where our consent is not respected about our bodies are kind of embedded in everyday life. But then we also have this bad habit about talking about rape culture as if it's something outside of us. And I think that that's really problematic too.
I was writing last week about prison rape. So also this question that the system that we have to rely upon in order to seek justice for survivors. So when we say, the verdict is a lack of justice for survivors, but that very same system is a site of trauma for so many people who are incarcerated. So there's virtually no research. It's almost unspeakable in terms of acknowledging that this rape even happens or these assaults even happen for people. So this kind of troubling way that rape culture and our acknowledgement of it ends at the door of the prison. And that includes people convicted of sexual assault who are particularly highly vulnerable to violence within prison, for example, and sexual violence is seen as a punishment, that's something that this person deserves because they're guilty of sexual assault. So we'll talk about, that rapists deserve it, or don't get raped in prison, don't drop the soap. So this kind of way that the same discourse that we're relying upon for justice is also a discourse that is in itself highly implicated in violence for people inside as well.
Yeah, and I think we have a real Canadian problem in the sense that we don't have the data, and the data that we do have says, sexual assault in prisons isn't nearly as bad as in the United States, and the conversation stops there. And we know, and I think this is where sometimes overly intellectualized approaches to abolition become really problematic, because we know that double bunking leads to really high rates of sexual assault for men and male prisoners especially. So if we know that's the case, sometimes even as abolitionists, it becomes really hard to protest the construction of new prisons. And I know I've felt that kind of that tension in myself, where I don't want to see a new prison go up in rural Nova Scotia. I don't want to see rural Nova Scotians being given correctional work as the only employment that's available to them in their town. But at the same time, if it means that less guys get raped, it's tricky.
Well, I actually did attend a talk that suggested that while we think that what happens is that the building of prison responds to overcrowding and needs, he actually did the statistical analysis, and it turns out that the prisons are built and then they're filled. So that often the relationship is inverse to what we think. So the prisons aren't actually built in response to crowding. They're built, and then laws are passed that put more people in those prisons. So there was actually a mathematical analysis of this.
Yeah, and I think, too, when it comes to, I think we need to talk about men's sexual violence against other men. And I think that really helps us lose some of those heteronormative kind of white supremacist ideas about who the, archetypal rape victim is. But at the same time, I think our conversation about prison rape should also lead us into a larger conversation about sexual assault of men outside the prison as well. I think sometimes when we talk about decarceration, the idea of community feels safer. And, a lot of the men that I've worked with serving lifetime sentences, their lives prior to coming to the prison were not safe. And there was a lot of sexual abuse in the family, physical abuse in the family, substance use. There was a lot of kind of lack of security for them, too. So I think that if we can find a way to address the prison and deal with it as a tool of state violence, but also not think about the state as something that's outside of, the homes on our street. Because if it's happening in Vail, it's probably happening a few blocks down, no matter what neighborhood we live in. And I think that's important to remember, because one of the challenges to decarceration is this idea that it's the people inside prison are different from us. They are the bad people. Once again, that colonial line in the sand between good and bad, black and white.
There's also a historic discourse, for example, that you see when people were particularly advocating around rape, that the problem, and I put that in quotes, of the male rape victim. So you actually get discourse sort of saying that at the moment they're being assaulted, they become a woman because assault is gendered. So in this way that's very important, in that we recognize that rape has this gender component, that it's part of gendered violence against women in particular. But you get this kind of casualty of that where the male victim does not fit into that discourse, and you actually get discourse that feminizes him or ignores him or can't deal with that. And then, of course, that leads to this further stigma on male victims in particular.
Yeah, no, I agree with that as well. If you look at, I think there was a World Bank report not too long ago. They put up these research reports, scanning different hemispheres across the globe, and one of them was on causes of death, and they did some inter-American study on causes of death for men and women and children, and the statistics were huge. Men's premature death by violence is massive. Like, men are victims of violence in a way that we can't deny when we look at the data. So, I think there's a real imperative there to start finding ways to be able to grapple with the wounding and the terror and the fear that is implicit in having to take up and perform masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
That those are one and the same. And, once again, then we're in this gray area because we're taught that fear is not something that men feel. It's not. We're not allowed to simultaneously be scared and be victimized and be terrified and then also still be a man.
And it also becomes a racialized script as well, that so black men who are seen as threatening and are constructed. So when we have, for example, the shooting of Sean Bell, and it's ruled that whether or not he has a gun, the perception of threat is sufficient to justify his shooting. So this idea that de facto, by living in a black male body, you are a threat. And these things carry over into the courtroom as well, obviously. So that kind of idea of the way that the black body, the way that the indigenous body, the way the bodies of people who have visible tattoos, or the bodies of people who may associate with gangs, or all these other stigmas that are put upon male bodies that contribute to male bodies being criminalized in particular ways as well. I often find, for example, that people, there's sort of also a perfect criminal victim, right? So we can feel sorry for, say, a woman who was, and I'm not saying we shouldn't feel sorry for a woman who was, say, convicted for shoplifting baby formula in a snowsuit, but it's a lot more difficult to feel sympathy or empathy for a male perpetrator who's accused of a violent crime. Right. And that's a kind of complicated, how we sort of draw these lines, how we think about people who have created harm, people who have harmed people and have done terrible things. But that kind of discourse around how we deal with them, I think, and it's very complicated and very lacking.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us in Halifax are facing what's going to be a really tough few months, after the death of Kristen Johnston. Halifax is a small town, and she knew a lot of people here, and that's going to be a complicated case. And I think that's where, when we start to connect the dots between, Angela Davis talking about how, domestic violence, well, I think it's domestic in terms of the state and domestic in terms of the home. Domestic violence is learned in culture, and I think that's where, if we start confronting some of the myths around risk, this idea that we get harmed by strangers or we get harmed by racialized people, and we stop displacing our fears and realizing that, we should be more afraid of each other and our partners and maybe our family members, really trying to grapple with what it means to be able to love and harm simultaneously, and then also try and grapple with what it would mean for a good person to do something really horrible. And I think that really questions our notions of, what it means to be human and what it means to be safe and what it means to be in love. But I think that those really messy conversations where we have to hold those two ideas parallel, I think ultimately serve the broader project of decarceration. One of the ways that I deal with it on a day-to-day basis is, female friends of mine will want to check in after they, walk home late at night. And I always call them on that. I always say, yeah, but, statistically speaking, I understand you feel unsafe walking home by yourself, but it's probably not going to be a stranger, right? It's probably more someone that you're going to be on a date with. I always use those moments not to invalidate the feelings of fear, but also to just remind ourselves that, violence isn't something that exists outside of us. It's embedded in our relationships with each other, in the way we mobilize power and privilege, in the way that it wounds us in experiences of oppression. And I think that just constantly avoiding that displacement instinct that we have to fear strategically and to fear politically, but without being critical of that and asking why we fear what we fear. I mean, when it comes to sex offenders, we know, the recidivism rates on certain first-time sex offenses are really, really low. And yet there's such stigma around sex offenders. But then we know, in other ways too, jail time without proper rehabilitation is ineffective for domestic violence, yet we don't have registries for people that beat their partners, right? So, I mean, I think, addressing the fear and being really critical and emotionally reflective, I think, is part of that decarceration process.
So obviously as feminists, a huge amount of anger right now around the Ghomeshi verdict. And one of the reasons for that is obviously historically the extremely low rates of reporting of assault, the extremely low rates of conviction for assault. So this becomes this very complicated question where on the one hand, conviction becomes tied to recognition, right? So the lack of conviction on sexual assault ties into the idea that women aren't taken seriously, the ways that women's narratives are challenged, obviously the ways that sexual assault is denied or erased, or if you're not the perfect victim. So this kind of question of how can we both think of other systems for doing this that lie outside of conviction, outside of the justice system, without also playing into this question of continuing to invalidate women's experiences or continuing to minimize rape, and that very difficult question. And I know there's no answer. Obviously, nobody just has the answer for the system, but what are some strategies you think that exist outside of convictions in the courtroom?
Yeah, I think that peer support is a really good model. And I think that, women and families and allies have been doing this for centuries through wars, through colonialism. I think that strengthening our kinship bonds and really kind of trying to queer those ideas of who we consider to be family when our families aren't safe. And really intentionally building relationships with each other where we can be honest about what we feel, where we believe each other. And I think that's one of the really positive things that I've seen around the Ghomeshi trial is just the message, I believe you, I believe you, I believe you. And I think that if we have, friendships, collegial relationships, if we can make a bit of a constellation of a network for ourselves of people that, validate us in that way and allow us to feel what we're feeling, I think that that's the first step, because I think that those kind of relationships and those networks are where you can have non-medicalized group counseling. You don't always need an expert. And there's probably someone in your social circle who may have experience or have done a couple years of social work school. I think that there are ways that we can heal each other without relying on the state. And I think that there are also ways that we can keep each other safe, which is, if there's someone in your community that's harming others, is that we shouldn't be silent because we're afraid of ruining their life or giving them a bad reputation. So in terms of one thing that really worries me is this, the responses to calling people out, on social media and saying so-and-so raped me, and then having other women say, yeah, they raped me too, and then that being considered collusion. I think that that's really dangerous, and that really stops the community conversations that we need to have around keeping each other safe, because I think that when it's secret, they have so much more power. And I think that when our relationships are founded on honesty and validation and a willingness to learn and accept that we might be colluding in abusive behaviors ourselves, and to be able to listen without defensiveness like a good ally should, I think that those are things that can't be taken away by violence. And ultimately, that makes a fertile ground in which we can come up with those solutions together.
And I think it's also important to say here that I don't think anybody's judging or invalidating a woman's decision to go through the court process by suggesting other strategies. I wouldn't want people to listen to that and think that, so you're saying if I chose to go to court that I'm somehow not in the cause of justice or I'm contributing in these ways. Clearly these are individual decisions and they're difficult, but I think these conversations to be had, it's these difficult conversations that I've been having all day with different women and trying to get other perspectives, because it seems particularly in the media there's a very binary perspective, so either you're, a rape supporter or there's this one other way of speaking. But of course women's experiences are incredibly diverse, or women-identified people. And that kind of inability to have this conversation, I think in some ways contributes further, as you said, to the silencing around assault, the silencing around the varied narratives people have. If you're a woman of color and your narrative doesn't sound like what's in the media, there becomes no place of recognition for your way of dealing with assault, the way that your community sees assault, which may be different as well. So that's one reason why I wanted to have these conversations, is to try and open a space where we're saying things that may be challenging, that people may disagree with, but I think it's very crucial that we open up spaces where we can disagree, so we can figure out also what those points of contention are, what the points are where we're together, and come to some kind of synthesis sometimes on those.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is so important. We don't need consensus on this. What we need is an ability to not feel all the same thing at the same time and have that be okay. To not judge how we're feeling. I think that one of the things I always tell my students is that when it comes to transformative and restorative justice, if a victim is feeling angry and vengeful, that's fine. But then those of us who maybe weren't involved directly in the crime, maybe we're the ones who can go in and volunteer and be in a circle of accountability and support, and maybe go in and play basketball with this guy, to help the perpetrator build a sense of self and build a sense of community and accountability. And, it shouldn't always be up to the victim to forgive, and I think that kind of burden that, victims should have to forgive in order for us to have a restorative or transformative.
Which is also a very feminized narrative, of course, because it's particularly pushed upon female victims, right? To be nice, to forgive. And that's where it can become very problematic, where there's this kind of holding up of the people who forgive over the people that may want to be angry, and justifiably so.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like a total Christian colonial approach to judging our feelings, I think that if we're going to get through this together, we have to be willing to feel what we're feeling and to just let that be okay.